I've talked a lot about Indiana Jones on this channel before, but surprisingly, I haven't seen too many people talking about Indiana Jones icebergs. So in today's video, we're going to be talking about the definitive Indiana Jones iceberg created by Redditor Abandoned X Earth. However, I am going to make some little changes to this iceberg, and I'm also going to convert it into the traditional iceberg format. And for those of you who don't know what an iceberg is, it's basically a chart that is used to better display layers of information. Entries that are very well known or on the surface level will be put near the top of the iceberg, but the lower we get down the iceberg, the more obscure these entries will get. So without further ado, let's explore the Indiana Jones iceberg.
Fortune and glory, kid. Fortune and glory.
The Indiana Jones movies. Of course, when talking about this franchise, the most well-known thing about it is the movies themselves: Raiders of the Lost Ark, Temple of Doom, Last Crusade, Crystal Skull, and Dial of Destiny. Video games. Like every great franchise, Indy has himself a fun collection of video games. Some of these games are very fondly remembered by fans, including Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis, Infernal Machine, Emperor's Tomb, Staff of Kings, and even LEGO Indiana Jones. Star Wars Easter eggs. Of course, with George Lucas being the creator of both Indiana Jones and Star Wars, it makes total sense for there to be several references to his favorite franchise. The nightclub in the opening of Temple of Doom is actually called Club Obi-Wan. You can see a hieroglyphic of C-3PO and R2-D2 during the scene where they find the Ark of the Covenant. And Jock's plane is also called OB-CPO, a reference to Obi-Wan and C-3PO. The Wilhelm Scream. Easily one of the most iconic sound effects of all time, the Wilhelm Scream was used in the 1951 film Distant Drums, where a character named Sergeant Wilhelm is attacked by an alligator. George Lucas loved this scream so much that he used it in the original Star Wars trilogy, and it eventually found its way into Indiana Jones. The Young Indiana Jones Chronicles. Airing in the 90s and created by George Lucas, The Adventures of Young Indiana Jones was a TV show about the adventures of a young Indy in the early 20th century. In the show, we get to see some of Indy's early treasure hunts, and we also get to see his adventures in World War I. I've actually got a full retrospective and review of this show, but be sure to go check it out after watching the rest of this iceberg. I'll leave a link to it in the description. Books. Indy has his fair share of books. Some of these were released after Last Crusade in the 90s, and some of these were made during the release of Crystal Skull in the 2000s. Comic books. Like books and video games, Indy has himself a fair collection of comic books. Some of these were released by Dark Horse Comics and some of them were released by Marvel. I've actually read a few of these and they're pretty decent. Indy's real name. Indy's real name is Dr. Henry Walton Jones Jr. or Dr. Henry Walton Indiana Jones Jr.
Meet me at Omar's. Be ready for me. I'm going after that truck.
How?
I don't know. I'm making this up as I go.
Temple of the Forbidden Eye. Located at Disneyland, California, Temple of the Forbidden Eye is an Indiana Jones themed ride that is fondly remembered by fans and parkgoers. The ride has been around since the 90s and was even recently refurbished for Dial of Destiny. Epic Stunt Spectacular. Located at Hollywood Studios in Orlando, Florida, Indiana Jones Stunt Show Spectacular is a stunt show that is pretty spectacular. In the show, they reenact scenes from Raiders of the Lost Ark with some pretty impressive stunts. If you ever find yourself in Hollywood Studios, I would definitely recommend checking this one out. Abner Ravenwood. Abner Ravenwood was Marion's father and was also Indy's mentor. Indy was Abner's best student, but after unseen conflicts involving Indy and Marion's relationship, Indy and Abner never spoke again. Abner was obsessed with the Ark of the Covenant and was even the person who found the headpiece to the Staff of Ra. Despite Abner being a very prominent character in Indy's life, he's never made any on-screen appearances aside from concept art and cancelled projects. Vlad Dracula. In the Young Indiana Jones episode Masks of Evil, Indy fights Dracula. Yeah, that Dracula. Belloq eats a fly. Near the end of Raiders, a bug seems to fly into Belloq's mouth. According to the actor who played Belloq, Paul Freeman, the fly flew away from his mouth at the last second, but the camera didn't pick it up. But a lot of people didn't know this, so it just looks like he eats a fly in a very important scene in the movie. Indiana Smith. Indiana Smith was the original name of Indiana Jones until it was changed to something much better. Old Indiana Jones. In the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, an old Indiana Jones would appear at the beginning and end of episodes to tell stories of his adventures. However, George Lucas, being George Lucas, edited these bookends out of later releases. Harrison Ford cameo. In the Young Indiana Jones episode Mystery of the Blues, Harrison Ford actually makes an appearance as Old Indy. He's in the episode for maybe 10 minutes, but it's freaking awesome. Han and Carbonite Theory. An age-old theory, this one states that Indy's adventures are merely dreams created by Han Solo while he was frozen in carbonite. I will say that to some extent, I do like this theory because it does make you think a little bit, it is creative, but there's no way that this could possibly be true. You're telling me that Han Solo, someone who has never been to Earth, suddenly has a lot of hallucinations and dreams about Earth, and is somehow historically accurate for the most part about true events? That just doesn't make any sense. I like to think that there is a connection between these two universes, but this just isn't the way to do it.
You're a teacher?
Part-time.
Raiders' original title. When Raiders was originally released in 1981, it was only called Raiders of the Lost Ark. It had no Indiana Jones in the title. When Lucas and Spielberg decided to make Indiana Jones a trilogy, they decided to go back and change Raiders of the Lost Ark to Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. Hangar 51. Hangar 51 is basically the Area 51 of Indiana Jones. It appears at the end of Raiders and the beginning of Crystal Skull. It houses the Ark of the Covenant, alien corpses, and who knows what else. Garth. Garth, also known as Fedora, was a thief for hire who greatly inspired Indy and also gave him his trademark fedora. For a good while, it was speculated that Garth and Abner Ravenwood were the same person, but later on in external media, it was confirmed that they are in fact two different people. I really like to think that Garth influenced the more treasure hunting side of Indy, while Abner Ravenwood had to do with the archaeology side of Indy. Indiana. Indiana was an Alaskan Malamute that Indy had as a kid. He was so fond of Indiana to the point where he ended up naming himself after the dog. And here's a fun fact, Indiana was actually based off of a real dog that George Lucas had that was also an Alaskan Malamute and was also named Indiana. This same dog was also the inspiration for the name Chewbacca. James Bond connections. For those of you who don't know, Spielberg originally wanted to direct a James Bond movie, but the studio that owned the rights to Bond refused to give him permission to film anything. Lucas then presented the idea of Indiana Jones to Spielberg, and the rest is history. Despite not being able to direct a Bond film, Spielberg still included a few references to one of his favorite franchises. The suit that Indy wears at the beginning of Temple of Doom is awfully similar to one that is worn by Bond in the movie Goldfinger, and they even got Sean Connery to play Indy's dad. The Spear of Destiny. Also known as the Lance of Longinus, the Spear of Destiny was a Roman spear that pierced the side of Jesus Christ while he was on the cross. It makes an appearance in the prologue of Dial of Destiny, however that one was actually a fake. But there was a series of comic books where Indy did go after the real Spear of Destiny, which had magical powers. Lapel Flowers. In Last Crusade, every villainous faction that tries to kill Indy wears a flower of some kind. Indy even gives Elsa a flower to signal that she's bad news. Indy is a predator. This is an entry that I really don't want to talk about, but let's just get this over with. When Indy was 27 years old, he had an affair with a 15-year-old Marion Ravenwood, and after Abner found out about it, they had a falling out. I still don't really understand as to why Lucas and Spielberg added this into the movie, but yeah, it really makes you think less of this character. I will say though, I did find Karen Allen's whole take on this thing to be a little interesting. She defended Indy by saying that we never found out what the circumstances of that relationship actually was, and it might have been one-sided, it might not have been much, or the whole situation might have been much different than we all envisioned it to be. I mean, they got married in Crystal Skull, so I guess it turned out okay, but I don't know, I don't want to talk about this anymore. Indy's mother. Anna Jones was Indy's mother and was the peacekeeper between him and his dad. She passed away when Indy was only 12 years old, succumbing to scarlet fever. She decided to hide her illness from Indy and his dad because she didn't want to worry them or distract Indy's father from his studies. Super Bowl 29. In 1995, we got Super Bowl 29, an Indiana Jones themed halftime show that was kind of fun, but at the same time, just a little cheesy. The halftime show was supposed to promote Temple of the Forbidden Eye, but it doesn't even have much to do with Indiana Jones. They just had some singers pop up on stage, build some temple-like set pieces, and they called it a day. I mean, if I was a kid in the 90s watching this, I would have absolutely loved it, but it looks simultaneously expensive while also looking really, really cheap. But I guess they pulled it off because only Disney could make an entire Super Bowl halftime show promoting a single ride. The Soderbergh Cut. Created by Steven Soderbergh, the Soderbergh Cut is a special cut of Raiders of the Lost Ark that removes all of the color, sound, and music from the film. This was done as an experiment by Soderbergh to better understand the cinematography and visual storytelling that Steven Spielberg implemented into Raiders. Raiders the Adaptation. Raiders the Adaptation was a fan film made in the 80s by a couple of friends, and it was a shot-for-shot recreation of Raiders of the Lost Ark. This might not seem like much, but at the time this was kind of revolutionary. Nowadays we get a lot of big projects among fans like fan films or reanimations, but at the time this had never been done before. Temple of Doom's darker tone. During the production of Temple of Doom, both Lucas and Spielberg were going through divorces. This caused the movie to be much darker than it was intended to be, and it also lacked focus. Spielberg has stated that while he doesn't hate Temple of Doom, he's not very proud of it because of the impact that the divorces had on it. Indiana Jones and the Saucermen. Indiana Jones and the Saucermen was one of the early titles considered for Crystal Skull. Now these are not directly related, but there was a draft for a fourth movie and it was called Indiana Jones and the Saucermen from Mars. Despite this draft for a fourth movie having some notable differences from the final product, it does contain a few similarities like aliens, Soviet Russians, and Indy getting married. Indy doesn't matter in Raiders. A decently popular theory, this one states that Indy had no impact on the story of Raiders, and that regardless of his involvement, the outcome would have been exactly the same. I've never really liked this theory because it seems like whoever made it hadn't even seen the movie that they were talking about. If it wasn't for Indy, Marion might have died, the Nazis would have found the Ark on their own, and the Ark would have never ended up in the hands of the US government. Whenever someone brings up the argument that Indy doesn't matter to the story of Raiders, I'm just kind of thinking, did you even watch the movie? Old Indy bookends are in a different timeline. Because Dial of Destiny sort of rewrites the timeline and erases the old Indy bookends, it's safe to say that those bookends are no longer canon. This has caused fans to speculate that the old Indy bookends take place in a different timeline where Dial of Destiny isn't canon. I personally like to think that there's two Indiana Jones timelines, one where only the movies and Young Indy are canon, and another where all of the books, comics, and video games, along with Old Indy, are canon. Eeyore Sign. In the line for Temple of the Forbidden Eye, an obscure sign of the Winnie the Pooh character Eeyore can be seen in the back of a room. According to my sources, the ride was originally built on an old parking lot, and the parking lot used signs of Eeyore. So it seems like the park staff decided to put one of the signs up to pay homage to the original parking lot. R-rated Raiders cut. Raiders of the Lost Ark was originally given an R rating for the amount of violence in the movie. The original opening of the Ark scene was supposed to be much gorier, but it had to be toned down in order to get the PG rating. Surprisingly, Temple of Doom also got a PG rating, despite a lot of parents complaining that it was way too violent to be considered PG. This was at a time when movies were either PG or R, and there was no in between. Temple of Doom was just violent enough to the point where a new rating was made, PG-13. Explorers Books. The Indiana Jones Explorers Books was a series of educational books that would talk about ancient civilizations. These books are decently obscure, and they're basically normal educational books with the Indiana Jones name on them. Secret of the Stone Tiger. Part of an event called the Summer of Hidden Mysteries in 2008, Secret of the Stone Tiger was a limited-time mini-show at Disneyland. It was one of those shows where characters would interact with the audience and they would have some fun activities and shenanigans for around 30 minutes. Indy isn't even in the show for very long, but escaping the Cave of Wonders as his entrance is honestly kinda cool. There's not much else to say here, it's basically what you would expect from a show like this.
You lost today, kid. But it doesn't mean you have to like it.
Find Your Fate Adventures. Find Your Fate Adventures was a series of interactable Indiana Jones books where you could choose where the story would go. Some of these were actually written by R.L. Stine, the author behind the Goosebumps series. Indiana Jones and the Monkey King. Indiana Jones and the Monkey King was a concept for an Indiana Jones movie that was never fully realized. The movie would have had Indy facing off against Sun Wukong, the Monkey King from Chinese mythology. But despite multiple attempts at turning this story into a video game or movie, it's always turned down in favor of something else. Indiana Jones and the Monkey King was going to be the third movie until it was turned down for Last Crusade, and then it was going to be a video game until it was turned down for Staff of Kings. But to be honest, I kinda don't want Indy fighting off against a god, so I'm kinda happy this one didn't happen. Hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphics are a series of hieroglyphic-like symbols that can be found around Disneyland and can be translated into secret messages. Wan Lee. Wan Lee is Short Round's real name. That's basically it. Titanic. So I was really debating whether or not I should put this on the iceberg, but there is a young Indiana Jones book where Indy survives the sinking of the Titanic. Yes, this was a real thing. The Lost Delta Expedition. The Lost Delta Expedition is an in-universe explanation as to how Indy found the Temple of the Forbidden Eye. Basically, Indy and Sala went on the Lost Delta Expedition in Asia and eventually found the Temple of the Forbidden Eye. Secret of the Incas. Released in 1954, Secret of the Incas was a movie that greatly inspired Indiana Jones, and it clearly shows. Aside from this movie being an adventure about treasure hunting, the main character Harry Steele bears a striking resemblance to Indiana Jones, and everything about the movie is basically an Indiana Jones movie made in the 50s. As we go down the iceberg, you'll find out that Spielberg and Lucas took a lot of inspiration from things that they loved, and Secret of the Incas is easily one of the most prominent inspirations. Gunga Din. Released in 1939, Gunga Din was another film that greatly inspired Indiana Jones, but this one specifically inspired Temple of Doom. The movie contains a bridge scene, shadowy imagery, and depictions of a Hindu cult that are all very similar to things seen in Temple of Doom. Scrooge McDuck comic. Another piece of media that greatly inspired Indiana Jones, Uncle Scrooge the Seven Cities of Gold, was a comic that greatly inspired the opening of Raiders. In the comic, the Beagle Boys grab an artifact off of a pedestal, only for it to trigger a boulder trap. You know, I wonder where we've seen that before. Das Boot Submarine. The submarine used in the 80s film Das Boot was also reused as a Nazi submarine near the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark. Roy Chapman Andrews. Roy Chapman Andrews was a famous paleontologist and explorer of the 20th century who is widely considered to be the real-life inspiration for Indiana Jones. Staff of Kings novelization. Despite Staff of Kings going through development hell, a novelization of the story was meant to be released. However, because Staff of Kings was delayed several times, it created problems with the distribution of the book. To everyone's disappointment, the novelization was then cancelled, and for several years it would never see the light of day. Until March of this year, where the author of the novelization, Rob McGregor, released it as a free ebook online.
Ein Amerikaner, Herr Oberst. Er war am Tor, hat sich als Offizier ausgegeben.
The Lost Horizon. Indiana Jones and the Lost Horizon was a cancelled comic by Dark Horse. However, what stands out about this comic is that if it was released, this would have been the first official appearance of Abner Ravenwood. And because of the cancellation of Lost Horizon, we've still yet to see Abner Ravenwood appear in any official media. Indiana Jones Land. Indiana Jones Land was planned to be an Indiana Jones themed section in Disneyland Paris. But due to budget restrictions, a planned complex was then reduced to a single ride. So instead of getting a dedicated Indiana Jones section of Disneyland, we instead got a roller coaster called Indiana Jones and the Temple of Peril. The Lost Expedition. Not to be confused with the Lost Delta Expedition, Indiana Jones and the Lost Expedition was a planned expansion to the Adventureland section of Disneyland. However, because this expansion was going to be very expensive, it was then turned down in favor of building Splash Mountain. Indy's extended family. Before Dial of Destiny and Crystal Skull, extended media depicted Indy with several family members that we never got to see. Previous marriages, kids, cousins, grandkids, Indy has a whole family that we really don't see much of. But because of Crystal Skull and Dial of Destiny, most of these characters are no longer canon. The Lost World. Completely unrelated to Jurassic Park, Indiana Jones and the Lost World was a rumored draft for a movie that would have had Indy going after dinosaurs. The movie would have opened up with a motorcycle chase across the Great Wall of China before Indy accidentally discovers a valley filled with dinosaurs. Supposedly, the reason this never happened was because Spielberg was never given permission by the Chinese government to film on the Great Wall of China. Even though we never got a movie out of this idea, it seems like some of these ideas were recycled for an Indy novel, Indiana Jones and the Dinosaur Eggs, where Indy travels across Mongolia in search of a Triceratops. City of the Gods. Indiana Jones and the City of the Gods was an early script for Crystal Skull that bears striking similarities to the final product. Aside from a few minor differences like the absence of Mutt, the script is near identical to Crystal Skull. Wrong Stone. An interaction rumored to happen behind the scenes of Temple of Doom. During one of the early screenings of the film, one of the editors changed the scene where Indy gives the rock back to the village, adding in a line saying, "You brought back the wrong stone." Spielberg wasn't happy about this because someone tampered with this film, but after finding out that it was a harmless prank, he laughed about it with everybody else. Dance of Death. Indiana Jones and the Dance of Death was another cancelled comic series by Dark Horse. The comic would have had Indy facing off against the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse from the Book of Revelations. Like Indiana Jones and the Monkey King, I think this is where I draw the line. The comic would have also had Indy fighting against zombies, and while I'm not against Indy facing off against the undead, the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse is just a little too much. Castle of Blood. Indiana Jones and the Castle of Blood was a script for a third movie that would have been much more horror-based. Not very much is known about the details of the script, but it is known that Spielberg wanted to do a more lighthearted film after Temple of Doom, and that's why he rejected Castle of Blood as the third Indy film. But I don't think that stopped Lucas, because in the Young Indiana Jones episode Masks of Evil, Indy goes to a gothic castle where he's confronted with the supernatural and Dracula himself. The whole tone of the episode is much darker than the rest of the show, and it's easy to see where Lucas might have recycled ideas from Castle of Blood. It took us a while, but we finally made it to the last tier of the Indiana Jones iceberg. In this tier, we're going to be looking at some of the most obscure and interesting entries on this list. So enough stalling, let's get into the final tier. Indy's character arc. One thing that is severely overlooked by Indy fans is Indy's character arc throughout the series. In Last Crusade, a young Indy learns that being the good guy doesn't make you a winner. When we next see Indy in Temple of Doom, he's a much more shady person, making deals with Chinese gangsters and endangering his partners. And in Temple of Doom, Indy's motivation for treasure hunting isn't for archaeology, but fortune and glory. At the end of Temple of Doom, Indy is a much different person, giving the Shankara Stone back to the village. In Raiders, Indy is a morally better person, and his motive for the Ark of the Covenant is for archaeology. And in Last Crusade, Indy becomes much more heroic. Now that is a very short summary of Indy's character arc, so if you would like to see a video going more in detail, I would highly recommend watching Channel Awesome's video on it. It's a very, very good video. I'll leave it in the description, but be sure to go check it out after watching the rest of this iceberg. Thuggie's Slave Master. While rewatching Temple of Doom, I noticed a small detail that's actually kind of disturbing. Remember the Black Sleep, that thing that could mind control people? Well, according to the lore, fire is the only thing that can break the curse, but what if I told you that there was something else? You see, while Indy's fighting the Thuggie's slave master, when he drops a large rock on his head, he seems to regain consciousness and starts to be aware of his surroundings. Throughout the movie, he's depicted as a husk of a person who cannot feel pain, but right after this, he's aware of the situation he's in and even begs Indy for help. It seems like there's another way to counter the blood of Kali, but unfortunately for this guy, he was too late. Belloc's son. According to the book, The Greatest Adventures of Indiana Jones, Belloc actually had a son that wanted to enact revenge on Indy. The book says that Indy was confronted by Belloc's son at some point, and that he didn't believe Indy's explanation for his father's death. The book also says that Belloc's son was going to take revenge at some point, but this never ended up happening. Tom Selleck's screen test. Actor Tom Selleck was originally considered to play Indy, but because of his contract with Magnum PI, he was unable to accept the role. Eventually, footage of Tom Selleck auditioning for the role was released, and it's safe to say that it would have been a much different movie. Even though we'll never get to see Tom Selleck as Indiana Jones, there was an episode of Magnum PI which was Indiana Jones themed, where you could get an idea of what a movie with Tom Selleck would have been like. The Lost Diaries. The Lost Diaries of Young Indiana Jones was a cancelled series of educational books. Because this book series was cancelled, there really isn't a lot of information about it. Uncensored Belloc death. I mentioned earlier how Belloc's death scene had to be toned down for the PG rating of Raiders, but what if there was a version of the uncensored death somewhere out there? Well, this piece of lost media was found a while ago. It's a screenshot of the original uncensored Belloc death featuring an exploding puppet. But in my opinion, the censored version is actually better. If you look closely at the puppet of Belloc, it looks kinda fake. But adding a layer of flame over the puppet sort of covers up some of the fakeness of it. While a part of me does want to see the original uncensored version, I still think that the version we got in the final product is still superior. Raiders of the Lost Jedi. Raiders of the Lost Jedi Temple of Doom was a one-night-only show at Disney World Hollywood Studios. The show was basically a modified version of the stunt show Spectacular, but it was a crossover with Star Wars. Some of the most notable things about the show include Indy getting a hold of a lightsaber, decapitated Jar Jar, and Indy facing off against Boba Fett, Darth Maul, and Darth Vader, and defeating each of them in a 1v1. The stunt show has a lot of good fan service, and for an Indiana Jones Star Wars collab, I actually think this is pretty good. It's kinda sad that this version of the stunt show only lasted for a day. Into the Great Unknown. Here we are, guys, the final entry. While I don't think this entry is the most obscure or disturbing, it's by far the most interesting, and it's easily my favorite on this list. Into the Great Unknown is a Star Wars comic that asks the question, what if Han Solo crash-landed into Earth? The comic opens with Han and Chewie trying to escape the Empire, before having to blindly jump to lightspeed. They then crash-land on Earth in the 19th century, where they are attacked by Native Americans who confuse Chewbacca for Bigfoot. However, Han Solo doesn't survive this encounter, and then dies in Chewbacca's arms. We then cut to 100 years later where Indy and Short Round are in search of Bigfoot. While searching for the creature, they come across the Millennium Falcon, and they also find the corpse of Han Solo. Even though Indy has never seen anything like the Millennium Falcon before, he states that the whole scenario feels very familiar. Indy is oddly unsettled by what he's seen, and decides to drop the search for Bigfoot, claiming that it should be left to the Great Unknown. It is then revealed that after Han died, Chewbacca roamed the Pacific Northwest, becoming the infamous Bigfoot. I mentioned earlier how I didn't like the Han and Carbonite theory because it feels like a really forced way to connect these two universes, But this comic does a really good job at connecting Star Wars and Indy in a way that feels very natural. Even though this comic is probably not canon, I really love it for its creativity and its really natural way of connecting Star Wars to Indy. And because of that, it's easily one of my favorite entries on this iceberg. After 7 tiers of Indy content, I can finally declare that the Indiana Jones iceberg has been conquered. To everyone who made it this far into the video, I want to say thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate everyone who made it to the end and watched this entire iceberg. This has been my biggest project so far. I've never made an iceberg or any video that required so much editing and information put into it. So this has been one of my biggest and hardest projects to work on. So for everyone that made it to the end, thank you so much for watching. I also want to give a shout out to Abandoned X Earth, who created the original Indiana Jones iceberg that I used to create my own version of the iceberg. This would have taken so much longer if I would have had to research all of this by myself, but luckily there was an iceberg already made, so huge thank you to Abandoned X Earth for that. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. I would really appreciate it. Thank you all so much for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Share this with your friends. Thank you all so much for watching. God bless you guys, and I'll see you all next time.